The courtroom was silent, but the air was thick with tension. It wasn't just the weight of the case that had everyone on edge, it was the way power moved in this room, the way authority was used to crush those it saw as less than. And right now, all that power, all that corruption, was aimed at one person. A black woman, standing tall, standing proud, even as the so-called justice system tried to break her. The officer, towering over her, had a smirk stretched across his face. He had been waiting for this moment. To him, this wasn't just about control, it was about putting someone back in their place. His fingers curled around his belt, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights like it meant something. But to him, it wasn't about duty. It was about domination. You don't know when to shut up, do you? His voice dripped with arrogance as he stepped closer. The room, filled with people who should have said something, did nothing. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was suffocating. She had been defending herself, her rights, but none of that mattered to him. You people, he sneered, shaking his head as if he were disgusted to even be having this conversation. Always thinking you're smarter than you are. Always trying to act like you belong in places that were never meant for you. She didn't flinch. Didn't lower her gaze. She had faced worse than this before, and she would face it again. But he couldn't stand that. He wanted her to feel small. To know that, in his world, she had no power. The judge had barely paid attention to the exchange. Another black woman being mistreated in the system. It wasn't new. Wasn't worth their time. But what happened next, what happened in the next few moments, was something no one in that room would ever forget. The officer didn't just want to arrest her. He wanted to make an example out of her. Wanted everyone in that room to see that no matter how much she thought she belonged here, she never truly would. His hand shot out so fast that, for a second, it didn't feel real. Fingers wrapped around her throat, tightening. The courtroom gasped, but no one moved. No one stopped him. She struggled, but he was bigger. Stronger. He forced her against the wooden barrier that separated the audience from the legal teams. Chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted in discomfort, but still, no one intervened. You think you're better than me? He hissed, his grip tightening. You think you can come into my courtroom and run your mouth? She clawed at his hands, but he didn't let go. Then, finally, a voice rang out. That's enough. The judge, finally deciding this was going too far, banged the gavel. But the officer didn't let go immediately. He held on, just a few more seconds. Just long enough to send a message. Then, with a shove, he released her, letting her stumble back, gasping for air. Sit down, the judge ordered her, as if she had been the one to cause the scene. As if she hadn't just been assaulted in front of everyone. A sick smile tugged at the officer's lips as he adjusted his uniform. He had done what he wanted. Humiliated her. Reminded her of her place. Or so he thought. Because what he didn't know, what no one in that room realized, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The courtroom settled, but something had shifted. The energy in the room, the way people were looking at her now, something was coming. Something no one was prepared for. And in just a few moments, this officer, this man who had spent years getting away with his corruption, his violence, his unchecked power, was about to lose everything. Because she wasn't just another black woman. She wasn't just a victim. She was something else entirely. And the justice that was about to come for him? It would be swift. It would be undeniable. And it would be karma at its finest. So the question is, when the tables turn, when power shifts, when the truth finally comes crashing down, will he be able to handle it? Before we begin this story, we want to take a moment to say something important. Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism in any form. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of truth. If you've ever faced discrimination, know that your voice matters, your story matters, and you are not alone. This story is about injustice, but also about karma, redemption, and the power of standing up for what's right. We hope it resonates with you. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a twist. Let's begin. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and stale coffee, the kind of scent that clung to government buildings, a mix of authority and exhaustion. The fluorescent lights above hummed quietly, casting a cold glow over the space. Everything in this room was designed to impose power: the towering judge's bench, the stiff-backed chairs, the thick mahogany tables that separated the powerful from the powerless. And in the middle of it all, standing with an unshakable posture, was Aaliyah Carter. Aaliyah had walked into this courtroom fully aware of what awaited her. She had seen it 100 times before, black people walking into spaces that weren't built for them, only to be met with resistance, hostility, doubt. But Aaliyah wasn't the type to shrink under scrutiny. She had built her career on standing tall in rooms like this, on never letting them see her break. She was sharp, calculating, determined, a woman who had learned, early on, that the world would not hand her respect. She had to take it. At 38 years old, she had carved a path through the legal system with relentless ambition. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, she had seen firsthand what happened when the law worked against people who looked like her. It wasn't just about justice, it was about who got to decide what justice even meant. That's why she fought. Why she had spent years climbing the ranks of the Department of Justice, knowing that every case she won wasn't just about one person, but about shifting the scales, even if just a little. But today, she wasn't here as a prosecutor. She wasn't standing behind a polished podium with a stack of evidence in front of her, making her argument with precision and fire. Today, she was being accused. Silenced. Humiliated. The moment she had stepped into this courtroom, she had felt it, the way eyes lingered too long, the way whispers passed between officers and attorneys like she was already guilty. But she hadn't done anything wrong. Her only crime was speaking up, and that, in this room, was enough to make her a target. And at the center of it all was Officer Daniel Reeves. Reeves had been on the force for almost 20 years, the kind of cop who thought the badge made him untouchable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jawline that made people trust him without thinking twice. His uniform was always pressed, his demeanor always controlled. But underneath it all was something rotten. He had built his career on intimidation, on knowing exactly who he could push around and get away with it. And today, Aaliyah Carter was his next target. He had been watching her the entire hearing, arms folded over his chest, a smug look on his face. He loved this, watching a black woman fight for respect and knowing he could take it away with a snap of his fingers. Aaliyah had crossed him before. Not directly, but enough that he remembered her. Enough that he had been waiting for the moment he could put her in her place. She had called out police corruption in courtrooms like this, held people like him accountable, made sure that officers who abused their power didn't just walk away without consequences. And men like Reeves hated women like her. So when she spoke, when she challenged him, when she made it clear that she wouldn't be intimidated, he saw red. The courtroom had been in session for almost an hour when things reached their breaking point. Aaliyah had been trying to make a simple argument, presenting facts, clear and undeniable, about yet another case of police misconduct. She was calm, measured, but firm. She wasn't raising her voice, wasn't acting out of line. She was simply telling the truth. But for men like Reeves, the truth was always a threat. His voice cut through the courtroom, sharp and condescending, as he leaned against the witness stand with a smirk. "Lady, I don't know why you think anyone in here gives a damn what you have to say." Aaliyah didn't react immediately. She had dealt with men like him her entire career, men who thought disrespect was a substitute for intelligence. But before she could respond, Reeves stepped forward, just a little closer than necessary. His smirk widened. "I've seen women like you before. Always running their mouths, always thinking they know better. But at the end of the day, you're just another nobody trying to play in a world that ain't meant for you." The courtroom went silent. Aaliyah took a slow breath, steadying herself, refusing to let the anger bubbling inside her show. But before she could speak, Reeves took another step forward, his voice dropping lower, just for her to hear. "Maybe if you learned your place, you wouldn't find yourself in situations like this." That was the moment. The shift. Because Aaliyah wasn't afraid of him. She had never been afraid of men like him. She straightened, lifted her chin, and met his gaze without hesitation. "You know what your problem is, Officer Reeves?" Her voice was calm, dangerously steady. "You think fear is the same thing as respect. But the only thing people like you ever earn is resentment. And eventually, that comes back to bite you." His jaw tightened. The smirk faltered, just for a second. And that was all it took. Because in that second, in that moment of loss of control, he snapped. Before anyone could react, his hand was around her throat. The room erupted. Gasps. Chairs scraping. A judge calling for order. But no one moved fast enough. He held on, squeezing just long enough to send a message. Aaliyah refused to look away. Even as her breath shortened. Even as her hands clawed at his wrist. Even as the world around her blurred. And then, finally, he let go. She stumbled, catching herself against the table. Her hands were shaking. But her eyes? Her eyes never left his. And Reeves? He was smiling. Because he thought he had one. Thought he had put her in her place. Thought this was just another day of him walking away untouchable. But what he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that everything was about to change. Because this wasn't just any case. This wasn't just another black woman being mistreated by the system. Aaliyah Carter was not the kind of woman you could silence. And before this day was over, Officer Daniel Reeves was going to find out exactly what happens when the people you think you can step on turn out to be the ones who hold all the power. The tension in the courtroom had settled like a thick, invisible fog. No one knew exactly what to say, how to process what had just happened. The gavel had slammed down, voices had been raised, and yet, somehow, Reeves still stood there like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just wrapped his hands around a woman's throat in front of a judge, a jury, attorneys, and half the damn city. Like he was untouchable. The arrogance dripped off of him, from the way he adjusted his uniform like he was dusting off something insignificant to the way his eyes flickered with amusement, daring anyone to do something about it. Because that was the thing about power, it made men like him feel invincible. Aaliyah Carter wasn't someone who let emotions take control, but right now, her blood was boiling. Every fiber of her being screamed for justice, for accountability, for something to happen. But she had been in this system too long to let her anger cloud her judgment. This wasn't about lashing out. This was about strategy. Because if there was one thing she knew about men like Reeves, it was that they always thought they were safe. And that was where they fell. She forced herself to take a breath, to calm the fire raging in her chest. She had to be smarter than him, sharper than him. Reeves was already back to his place near the witness stand, his hands lazily resting on his belt as he leaned against the wood like he owned the place. His lips curled into a smirk, as if he was enjoying this. He wasn't just unafraid, he was amused. Judge Franklin, an older man with deep wrinkles and tired eyes, cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. Let's proceed." "Order in the court," he mumbled, his voice lacking conviction. His eyes darted toward Reeves, but it was clear he had no intention of addressing what had just happened. And that, more than anything, made Aaliyah's stomach turn. They were going to let him walk. Again. She had spent years watching these men walk away. Had seen the same corruption play out like a script, case after case. They bullied, they threatened, they killed, and the system just let them go. But today? Not today. Her attorney, Marcus Hill, a man she had known for years, leaned toward her, whispering. "We need to be careful with how we proceed," he murmured, his voice tense but controlled. "They're not going to do a damn thing unless we force their hand." Aaliyah clenched her jaw. "Then we force their hand." Marcus hesitated, scanning the room. He knew her well enough to see the steel in her eyes, the unshakable resolve that made her who she was. But he also knew what they were up against. "If you push too hard, they'll turn this on you," he warned. "They'll make it look like you were out of line. You know how they play this game." "I don't care," Aaliyah whispered back, her voice a blade. "He put his hands on me. He thinks he can get away with it. He won't." Reeves chuckled under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he muttered, tapping his fingers against his belt in a slow, mocking rhythm. "You look a little shaken. Not so tough now, huh?" Aaliyah turned to face him fully, her eyes burning. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." His smirk didn't waver. "Oh yeah? And what exactly are you gonna do about it?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The room was already shifting, the undercurrent of something brewing beneath the surface. The tension was no longer just coming from her, it was creeping through the room, wrapping around the onlookers, the attorneys, the court officials. They all felt it. Something was about to happen. The judge cleared his throat again, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Miss Carter, if you would, are we really just going to ignore what just happened?" Aaliyah cut in, her voice sharp but steady. She turned to the judge, her gaze unrelenting. "A police officer just physically assaulted me in front of this entire courtroom. And you're just going to move on like it didn't happen?" A murmur rippled through the spectators, hushed voices whispering to each other. Some of them were shocked, some were uncomfortable, but none of them were surprised. This was America. This was normal. Judge Franklin rubbed his temple, exhaling heavily. "This court is here to discuss the case at hand, not the case at hand." Aaliyah interrupted, stepping forward, her voice louder now. "The case at hand is about police misconduct. Corruption. Abuse of power. And in the middle of this case, right here, right now, in broad daylight, in front of a judge, one of your officers just tried to choke me out. And you want to act like that's not relevant?" Reeves scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. You're really gonna play the victim now?" Aaliyah turned to him so fast, he actually took a half step back. "You assaulted me." He shrugged. "You got in my face. I was standing still. You were being aggressive." Her eyes narrowed. "I was talking." His smirk returned. "And maybe next time, you'll know when to shut up." Aaliyah felt the rage twist inside her like a knife, but she didn't let it show. Not yet. Because she knew something Reeves didn't. She wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just some public defender, some activist they could brush aside. She had power. Real power. And right now, in this room, she was the only one who knew what was coming. Marcus must have felt the shift too, because he inhaled sharply, straightening his tie. "Aaliyah," he murmured, barely audible. "What do you know that I don't?" She didn't answer him. Instead, she looked directly at Reeves, her expression unreadable. "You really don't have a clue, do you?" she said quietly. Reeves rolled his eyes. "Lady, I don't give a damn who you think you are. You're nobody. Just another," but Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, cutting him off, her gaze holding something new now, something cold, something controlled. "You should really stop talking." For the first time, just for a fraction of a second, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Because something in her voice, something in the way she was standing, told him he had finally crossed the wrong person. And in the next few moments, that unshakable confidence of his, that smirk, that arrogance, it was all about to shatter. The moment hung in the air like a charged wire, ready to snap. The room was suffocating with the weight of tension, the silence more oppressive than any words could have been. Aaliyah stood there, her gaze unwavering, her presence felt like a force in the room. The smug look that had once been on Officer Reeves' face was gone now, replaced by something colder, something he had not prepared for. Fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear of realizing that the woman he had just tried to break was not as helpless as he had believed. Aaliyah took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes never leaving his. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, but she drowned them out, focusing solely on the man who had thought he could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, some with pity, some with disbelief, but none with the understanding of what was about to unfold. "You still don't get it, do you?" Aaliyah's voice cut through the silence, calm but heavy with a sense of finality. "You thought you could humiliate me, break me, and walk away unscathed. But that's not how this works." Reeves stood frozen for a second, his lips parting as if he were about to respond, but no words came. His arrogance, his cocky demeanor, began to crack under the weight of her words, and for the first time since the incident began, Aaliyah could see the smallest trace of uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't think you understand what's happening here," Aaliyah continued, her voice still smooth, but her eyes now blazing with something far more powerful than anger, justice. "This isn't just about you and me anymore. This is about something much bigger than you could ever fathom. You were never in control." The courtroom was still. Everyone watched in rapt silence, sensing that something monumental was happening, but no one had the courage to speak out. Some eyes darted nervously to the judge, but Franklin just sat back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him, clearly uncomfortable. He wasn't going to intervene. No one was. Aaliyah's gaze shifted slightly, just enough for her to make eye contact with the stenographer sitting at the front of the room, silently taking notes. The stenographer, a young woman with wide, nervous eyes, shifted uneasily in her seat, but Aaliyah held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, a silent exchange between the two of them that spoke volumes. "Let me remind you of something, Reeves," Aaliyah said, her words coming out in a slow, deliberate cadence that matched the gravity of the situation. "The law may not have caught up with you yet, but I am not just anyone. I am someone who has dedicated my life to making sure that men like you don't get away with it. I have the power to make you pay for every single one of your transgressions. I have the ability to bring down everything you've built. And today, I will." Reeves' face paled slightly, and for the first time, he took a half-step back. The crowd sensed it, the shift, the change in the atmosphere. But Aaliyah wasn't finished. She wasn't going to let him have the upper hand any longer. "You see, Reeves," she said, her voice growing colder, sharper. "I'm not just an attorney, a prosecutor. I'm someone who has spent years investigating people like you, watching you hide behind your badge, using it to protect your own corruption. I've watched you lie, I've watched you manipulate, I've watched you abuse your power. And now, you're about to realize that the world has caught up with you." The words hung in the air like a hammer about to fall. The truth, so simple, yet so devastating, was hitting Reeves like a freight train. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat, as if his body couldn't keep up with the realization crashing into him. Aaliyah let the silence stretch for a moment, feeling the weight of what was happening. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would prove to everyone, including herself, that the system wasn't invincible. "You don't know who I really am, do you?" she said, her voice low and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited for her next words. Aaliyah's eyes glinted with the kind of knowledge that could change everything. She took a step closer to Reeves, and he flinched, just a little. "You think I'm just a woman you can bully, a black woman you can put in her place with your badge and your lies. But the truth is," she continued, each word carefully chosen, "I'm someone who has been watching you, investigating you, and I'm not here as a prosecutor today." Reeves' eyes flickered with confusion, and then with recognition. Something clicked. Aaliyah's lips curled into a cold smile, and in that moment, she knew he finally understood. She wasn't just another target, another victim. She wasn't someone who could be dismissed. "I work for the United States Department of Justice," Aaliyah said, her voice suddenly louder, more powerful. "I am not just an attorney in this courtroom today. I am someone who has spent months gathering evidence, working with the FBI to bring people like you down. I've known about your corruption long before today. And guess what? This was never about the case you thought you were handling. It was about you." The words landed like a bombshell. The entire room seemed to gasp in collective realization. Reeves' face drained of color, and for the first time, his confident stance wavered. "You've been under investigation for months, Reeves," Aaliyah continued, her voice a sharp, cutting edge. "Every call you made, every text you sent, every crooked deal you made, you've been caught. And today, in this very courtroom, you just sealed your fate." For a moment, the room was dead silent. Not a single person moved. Reeves stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, horror, and fury all at once. The shock was too much for him to process in an instant, and he stood there, mouth open, no words coming out. You can't do this," he muttered, his voice shaking now. "Oh, but I can," Aaliyah said, the calmness in her voice sending a chill through the air. "And I will." The judge finally stirred, his voice coming out in a shaky rasp. "Miss Carter," but Aaliyah didn't wait for him to finish. She turned to the stenographer, who was now visibly shaking. "I need you to add something to your notes," Aaliyah said, her eyes never leaving Reeves. "The United States Department of Justice will be pressing charges against Officer Daniel Reeves for corruption, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights. Make sure that's in the record." The stenographer nodded quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she typed the words Aaliyah had just spoken. Reeves' face twisted with rage. "You can't do this," he repeated, his voice rising now, almost a shriek. "You have no evidence." "You can't," Aaliyah stepped forward, her figure looming over him, her voice low but powerful. "The evidence is already in your phone, Reeves. And I have copies of everything. Everything." And just like that, the weight of the truth came crashing down on him. The man who had thought he was invincible, who had bullied his way through every obstacle, who had believed the badge would protect him forever, was now standing on the precipice of his own downfall. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he stood there, speechless, Aaliyah took a final, slow step back. "You wanted to break me," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. "But it's you who's been broken all along." The room remained still for a moment, and then, slowly, the whispers began. The realization hit them all at once, this wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was the reckoning. The weight of the moment was crushing. The air in the courtroom felt dense, suffocating, as though the walls had drawn in closer to witness the spectacle unfolding before them. The shift was undeniable, where once there had been power radiating from Reeves, now there was only the tremor of a man realizing that he had finally run out of places to hide. His face, usually so smug and untouchable, had lost its color. His hands clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. His mouth opened once, then twice, but no words came. Aaliyah could feel the seismic shift in the room, the moment everyone collectively realized that Reeves was no longer in control of the narrative. It was his turn to feel small. His turn to choke on the silence of a system he had long thought was built to protect him. He wasn't smirking anymore. His arrogance had been replaced by something more primal, fear. The judge adjusted his glasses, his fingers tightening around the gavel as if he were trying to regain some sense of control over the room. "Miss Carter," he started, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something cautious in his eyes, something wary, as if he too was trying to process the gravity of what had just been said. Are you saying that?" Aaliyah didn't even turn to acknowledge him. Her focus remained solely on Reeves. She could see it now, the way his mind was racing, trying to calculate an escape. She recognized the flicker of desperation, the way his jaw locked as if he were holding back the urge to lash out. That was the thing about men like him, they didn't know how to exist outside of control, didn't know how to function when the game wasn't rigged in their favor. And now, with the tables turned, he was drowning in the very power he had once wielded. "You lied under oath, Reeves," Aaliyah's voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. "You obstructed justice. You fabricated reports. You brutalized innocent people and thought you could get away with it. And the worst part? You weren't even careful about it." Reeves' throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He shook his head, forcing a breathy chuckle that sounded hollow. "You're bluffing," he said, but there was no confidence in his voice, no trace of the bravado that had been there before. "You don't have anything." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a predator studies prey. "I have everything." "You really think the Department of Justice moves without evidence? That I would come in here, put my name on this, without the receipts to back it up?" She let the words sink in, let him feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. "You've been under surveillance for months, Reeves. Every text message, every call, every time you tampered with evidence, every dirty deal you thought was buried, it's all there. And after what you just pulled today?" She shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement that made Reeves' breathing stutter. "You handed me the last piece of the puzzle on a silver platter." His fists curled, his knuckles turning white. He was unraveling, cracking at the seams. "This is bullshit," he muttered, shaking his head again, more to himself than anyone else. "This is a setup." Aaliyah let out a humorless laugh. "A setup? You really think you're that important? That the federal government spent months building a case just to set you up?" She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear her next words. "You were just sloppy. And now, you're going to pay for it." A muscle in Reeves' jaw twitched, his entire body radiating the kind of tension that came from a man realizing he had been cornered. He looked around, his eyes darting to the judge, to the bailiff, to the people in the audience who had once been on his side. But now? Now they were just watching. Not stepping in. Not saving him. Because they knew. A nervous cough came from the front of the room. The stenographer was still typing, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. The courtroom clerk stood frozen, as if afraid to breathe too loudly. Even the officers standing along the walls, the very men Reeves had once commanded without question, were still. You don't know what you're doing," Reeves tried again, his voice rough, strained. "You're ruining a good man's life over a misunderstanding." Aaliyah arched a brow. "A misunderstanding? You put your hands on me, inside a courtroom, in front of dozens of witnesses. And that's just today. How many others have suffered because of you? How many people never got to stand here and call you out for what you are? How many families have you destroyed? How many people are dead because of you?" Her voice didn't waver, didn't break. "No, Reeves. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is justice." Reeves' breathing turned erratic. His fingers twitched toward his belt, toward his badge, as if he could still use it as a shield. But there was no shield left. No safety net. He had spent years believing himself untouchable. And now? Now the system he had abused, the badge he had hidden behind, was the very thing that was going to bury him. "You don't get to decide this," he spat, voice rising, desperation creeping in. "You don't get to, actually," Aaliyah interrupted, her voice razor sharp, "I do. Because you just assaulted a federal attorney in open court. And the only thing left to decide is whether you walk out of here in handcuffs, or if you want to make this even worse for yourself." The words landed with finality. Reeves' chest rose and fell in sharp, erratic movements. His eyes darted wildly, searching for something, anything that could save him. But there was nothing. No escape. No way out. Judge Franklin, who had been silent for too long, finally cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced between Aaliyah and Reeves, clearly weighing the gravity of the situation before exhaling heavily. "Bailiff," he said, his voice low but firm, "place Officer Reeves under arrest." The words crashed through the room like a thunderclap. There was a beat of pure, stunned silence. And then, chaos. Reeves lunged. His hands shot out, grabbing at the nearest thing, whether it was desperation or instinct, it didn't matter. But before he could get within inches of Aaliyah, 3 officers were on him. They yanked him back, twisting his arms behind him with practiced precision, slamming him face first onto the wooden table with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. The sound echoed through the courtroom, a heavy, brutal thud. "Get the hell off me!" Reeves snarled, his voice raw, his body thrashing. "This is a mistake. I'm one of you." The officers didn't listen. The cold, metallic snap of handcuffs echoed through the room. And then, for the first time in his life, Daniel Reeves was no longer the one in control. Aaliyah exhaled, slow and steady, as she watched him struggle. Watched the panic take hold. Watched the realization that, for the first time, he was the one being dragged away. "You should have stopped talking when I told you to," she murmured, her voice quiet but laced with satisfaction. Reeves' furious, wide-eyed gaze locked onto hers as the officers pulled him back. "This isn't over," he seethed. Aaliyah tilted her head, a knowing smirk tugging at her lips. "Oh, I know," she said softly. "It's just getting started." The echo of the handcuffs clicking shut still lingered in the air like an unshakable reminder of what had just unfolded. The courtroom, once buzzing with tension and unchecked arrogance, had fallen into a stunned silence. Officer Daniel Reeves, the man who had spent years terrorizing, manipulating, and abusing his authority, was now shackled, his wrists bound in cold steel, his face a mixture of disbelief and rage. He struggled against the officers holding him, but there was no longer any weight behind his fight. He knew, this was it. The power he had clung to for so long had been ripped from his grasp, slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was no getting it back. Aaliyah Carter stood still, watching as the scene played out before her. She wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating. She was processing. After everything, after the months of watching Reeves operate without consequence, after the years of seeing men like him walk free while people like her were forced to fight for every inch of dignity, it had finally happened. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It was real. It was here. And it had a face. Reeves' breathing was uneven, harsh and ragged, as he twisted his neck to glare at her. His face was red, not just from the force of being slammed onto the table, but from the realization that he had lost. "You think this means anything?" His voice was raw, sharp with desperation. "You think you've won something? You don't get it, do you? This whole system, this whole damn thing, it's rigged. You think they're really gonna lock me up? You think they'll let this stand?" Aaliyah didn't flinch. She had expected this reaction. Denial was always the first stage of a man's downfall. But she wasn't moved by it. Not anymore. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice steady. "You keep thinking this is about power. About who gets to control what. But what you don't get, Reeves, is that the moment you laid your hands on me in this courtroom, in front of all these people, in front of the law itself, you sealed your fate. You showed them exactly who you are." Reeves let out a bitter laugh, but it came out shaky. He looked around, desperate, searching for someone, anyone, who would come to his defense. His fellow officers. They weren't looking at him. The judge? Avoiding his gaze. Even the court clerks, the people who had spent years watching him manipulate the system in his favor, were sitting stiffly, unsure of what to do now that the tide had turned. "I gave 20 years to this city," Reeves spat, his voice laced with disbelief. I put away criminals. I protected people like you. Aaliyah let out a slow breath. No, she said, her voice cold, measured. You protected yourself. And you called it justice. Reeves' nostrils flared, his entire body vibrating with fury, but it didn't matter. Not anymore. The reality of what was happening was settling into his bones, and it was turning his arrogance into something else, panic. Aaliyah turned to the bailiff. Make sure he's processed properly, she said, her tone all business now. No favors. No special treatment. The bailiff nodded sharply. Even he wasn't arguing. Because everyone in that room knew the truth now, Daniel Reeves was no longer one of them. He was just another man in handcuffs, just another case file, just another name in the long list of those who had believed they were untouchable, only to realize that no one, was above the law forever. The officers started moving him toward the door, but Reeves wasn't done. He twisted one last time, throwing a glare at Aaliyah. You think this is over? His voice cracked slightly, the fear slipping through the cracks in his facade. You think I'm the only one like me? There are 100 more just like me. 1,000. You can't take us all down. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, the smallest smirk playing on her lips. Maybe not, she admitted. But today, I took down you. The door swung open, and with one final shove, the officers dragged Reeves out. The heavy thud of the door closing behind him sent a final pulse of silence through the room. It was over. But was it? Aaliyah felt a slow exhale escape her lips, but there was no real relief. Not yet. The weight of everything that had happened in the last hour still sat heavy in her chest. The people in the courtroom were still seated, still in shock, as if waiting for some final confirmation that what they had just witnessed was real. The judge rubbed his temples, the exhaustion settling into his face. The stenographer had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, as if even she didn't know how to put into words what had just unfolded. Marcus stepped up beside Aaliyah, his voice low. That was. He shook his head, at a loss. That was something else. Aaliyah nodded, but her mind was still moving, still calculating. He's not wrong, she murmured. He's not the only one. Marcus sighed, running a hand down his face. No, he's not, he agreed. And that's what makes this all the more complicated. Complicated. That was an understatement. Because this wasn't just about Daniel Reeves. It never had been. He was a symptom of a much larger disease. One arrest wouldn't fix what had been broken for generations. And that left Aaliyah with one burning question, a question that refused to leave the back of her mind, even as Reeves was taken away. What happens next? Would this change anything? Would the system fight back? Would people in power work to bury what had happened today, to make sure Reeves' downfall was nothing more than an isolated event instead of the beginning of something greater? Aaliyah didn't know the answer. Not yet. But she did know one thing. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The courtroom was still frozen in the aftermath, as if the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on every single person in the room. The energy had shifted, but not in the way people expected. It wasn't relief. It wasn't celebration. It was realization. A slow, creeping understanding that this wasn't the end, this was the beginning of something else. Something bigger. Aaliyah stood in the center of it all, her presence undeniable. Her pulse still thrummed in her ears, the echoes of everything that had just transpired still fresh in her mind. Reeves was gone, dragged out of the room in chains, but his words still lingered, gnawing at the edge of her thoughts. You think I'm the only one? You think you can take us all down? She knew the answer. She had known it long before today. Marcus exhaled beside her, running a hand down his face as he tried to process everything. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. I don't even know what to say right now. That was. He shook his head, searching for the right words, but they weren't there. Aaliyah didn't look at him. Her eyes were still locked on the judge, who sat motionless at the bench, fingers tapping against the wood as if debating whether to acknowledge what had just unfolded or pretend it had never happened. "You're not going to say anything, are you?" Aaliyah's voice cut through the silence, sharp but steady. "You're going to act like this wasn't a courtroom where a police officer just tried to kill a woman in broad daylight." Judge Franklin flinched, barely, but enough for her to notice. He exhaled through his nose, shifting in his seat. "This court is adjourned," he said, voice thick with discomfort. "We will reconvene at a later date too." Aaliyah let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "That's it," she pressed, stepping forward, her heels clicking against the floor with deliberate force. "That's all you have to say? A cop puts his hands around my throat in your courtroom, in front of a judge, and you're acting like it's just another case on the docket? No statement. No acknowledgement. No outrage." Franklin tightened his jaw, his hands clasping together in front of him. He wasn't looking at her. "Miss Carter, you sat there and watched it happen," she interrupted, voice carrying through the room, the weight of it undeniable. "You saw what he did. You saw how they all reacted. And yet, you want to sweep this under the rug, just like every other time, because it's easier than dealing with the truth." The judge finally looked up, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something conflicted. "This is bigger than just you, Miss Carter," he said slowly. "You know that." Aaliyah felt the burn of frustration in her chest, her nails digging into her palms. "That's the problem," she snapped. "It's always bigger than just one person. And that's exactly why it keeps happening." Marcus stepped in, placing a hand on her arm in a silent gesture to pull back, to give the judge a chance to respond without escalating the situation further. Aaliyah could feel the frustration radiating off him too, but there was something else, a quiet understanding. He had been in this system just as long as she had. He knew how this worked. Franklin sighed, pressing his fingers against his temple. "The system doesn't change overnight," he murmured. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't seen men like Reeves operate for years? You think this is the first time I've had to sit behind this bench and watch something happen that should have never happened?" Aaliyah studied him for a moment. There was no excuse in his voice, no justification. Just exhaustion. She didn't back down. "Then why didn't you do anything?" Franklin hesitated, just for a second, before meeting her gaze again. "Because power doesn't shift with words alone," he said, quieter now. "It shifts with action. And today, whether you meant to or not, you shifted something. But don't mistake today for a victory, Miss Carter. Because what you did, what just happened here, there will be consequences. There always are." Aaliyah clenched her jaw, the weight of his words settling over her like an iron cloak. She had known this, too. She had known it the moment she stood up against Reeves, the moment she decided she wasn't going to let it slide. Marcus exhaled beside her, running a hand over his jaw. "You know this isn't over, right?" he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "They're gonna push back. Hard." Aaliyah nodded, slow, deliberate. "Let them," she said simply. And that was it. That was the line in the sand. She turned, ready to walk out, ready to face whatever storm was coming next. Because she wasn't afraid. But as she reached the doors of the courtroom, just before she stepped out, she heard Franklin's voice once more, softer this time, almost resigned. "For what it's worth," he murmured, "I hope you don't stop." Aaliyah didn't turn back. She didn't need to. Because she wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. The heavy courthouse doors swung shut behind Aaliyah, sealing the room behind her like the closing of a chapter, yet the weight of what had just happened was far from over. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was eerily quiet, as if even the building itself was holding its breath. A few reporters had gathered near the entrance, their eyes locked on her like vultures waiting for a statement, a reaction, anything they could turn into a headline. But Aaliyah didn't stop. She kept walking, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her mind still burning with the words that had been spoken inside. Marcus was right behind her, his presence a steady force even in the chaos that was bound to follow. "You handled that well," he muttered, his voice low, careful. "But you know this doesn't just end here." Aaliyah exhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay composed. "I never expected it to," she said, barely above a whisper. "That was never the point." Marcus glanced sideways at her, his expression unreadable. "Then what is the point?" "Because I need to know you're thinking beyond today. That you understand the kind of war you just started." Aaliyah stopped walking. She turned to face him, her jaw tight, her heart still hammering from the adrenaline of the last hour. "The point, Marcus," she said, her voice laced with something deeper than anger, conviction, "is that people like Reeves get away with it because we let them. Because we watch. Because we wait for the right time, the right circumstances, the right moment to speak up. But there is no right moment. The moment is whenever you decide enough is enough." Marcus let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. He looked tired, more than tired, worn down, like a man who had fought too many battles and was still standing, but only barely. "And what happens when they come for you next?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. "Because they will. You embarrassed the system today, Aaliyah. You didn't just expose Reeves, you exposed how easily they let him operate. How many people turned a blind eye. You think they're going to let you walk away after that?" Aaliyah didn't flinch. "I don't need them to let me walk away," she said. "I need them to know I'm not afraid." Marcus shook his head, frustration flashing in his eyes. "It's not about fear," he said, his voice harder now. "It's about strategy. You've got them on the defensive, but that doesn't mean they won't hit back harder. You saw how the judge reacted, he knows the whole damn system is cracking under the weight of what just happened. The higher-ups? The ones who actually run this city? They're already figuring out how to contain this, how to make sure this doesn't turn into something bigger." Aaliyah's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew Marcus wasn't wrong. But she also knew something else, there was no containing this. Not anymore. Before she could respond, the low murmur of voices grew louder, the reporters sensing their moment. Someone stepped forward, a microphone already in hand. "Miss Carter, would you care to make a statement regarding Officer Reeves' arrest?" Aaliyah could feel Marcus tense beside her, his silent warning clear, "Don't give them more ammunition." But Aaliyah had spent too much time watching the world spin narratives that weren't true, watching stories get twisted into something they were never meant to be. This time, she was going to control the story. She turned toward the cameras, her posture unwavering, her voice steady. "The only statement I have," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd, "is that today was not an isolated event. What happened in that courtroom was not just about one officer. It was about a culture of silence, about a system that protects abusers until they finally cross a line too public to ignore. But I want to be very clear, Reeves is not the exception. He is the rule. And the only reason he was held accountable today is because someone finally said, enough." The reporters were scribbling furiously now, camera flashes illuminating the hallway. Someone else spoke up. "Do you believe more officers should be investigated for misconduct?" Aaliyah didn't even hesitate. "I believe," she said, "that if Reeves was allowed to operate the way he did for years, then the real question should be, who else knew? And why didn't they stop him?" The murmurs grew louder, and Marcus shifted beside her. "That's enough," he murmured, his voice low. "They'll twist this into a witch hunt." Aaliyah didn't take her eyes off the cameras. "Maybe it should be." She turned before they could press further, walking away from the chaos she had just ignited, feeling the weight of every step, feeling the momentum. She knew what this meant. She knew that after today, her name wasn't just going to be on court documents and legal briefs, it was going to be in headlines, in news segments, in the mouths of people who wanted to shut her down. Marcus caught up with her as they reached the courthouse steps, his voice low and urgent. "You just painted a target on your back." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. "Good," she said. "Let them see me coming." But the truth was, she wasn't naive. She knew what happened when you exposed the wrong people, when you forced accountability where it had been avoided for too long. She knew that this wasn't just about Reeves anymore. It was about the entire system that had let him thrive. And when you went after a system that deeply ingrained, there were consequences. But there had always been consequences. For people who looked like her, who spoke up, who didn't just accept injustice as part of life, there were always consequences. The only difference now. She was ready for them. Marcus sighed heavily, shaking his head. "Just, promise me you'll be careful," he muttered, rubbing his temple. "This kind of fight. It doesn't end in a courtroom." Aaliyah nodded, but her eyes were already on the city in front of her, on the battle that was still unfolding beyond those courthouse walls. "I know," she said softly. "But that's exactly why I have to keep fighting." Because Reeves was just the beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of noise, attention, and consequences. The moment Aaliyah stepped out of that courthouse, she knew things would never be the same. The story had exploded across every media outlet. Disgraced officer arrested for corruption and assault in courtroom meltdown. Federal prosecutor exposes police abuse in shocking trial. A moment of reckoning for the justice system. The headlines came in waves, each one unraveling the layers of corruption Reeves had thrived in for years. But this wasn't just about him anymore. His downfall had sent tremors through the system, pulling others down with him. Internal investigations were launched across the department, and suddenly, names that had been whispered in back rooms were now plastered across reports. Officers who had once laughed in private, thinking they were invincible, were now sitting across from investigators, their careers hanging in the balance. Some resigned before they could be questioned. Others lawyered up. But the walls were closing in, and they all knew it. Reeves had been the first to fall, but he wouldn't be the last. For Reeves himself, there was no redemption, no last-minute save. He was being held without bail, pending multiple charges, civil rights violations, falsifying reports, obstruction of justice, aggravated assault. Every case he had ever worked on was now under review, every conviction he secured tainted by the stain of his corruption. And worst of all for him, he had no allies left. The same system he had weaponized for years had turned its back on him the moment he became a liability. He wasn't special. He wasn't protected. He was just another disgraced officer, rotting in a cell, waiting for the inevitable. Aaliyah had no sympathy for him. But what surprised her was how many people wanted her to be quiet. The calls came almost immediately. Not threats, at least, not the obvious kind. "You've done enough. The public's already on your side. Maybe it's time to step back and let things run their course." These weren't messages of support. They were warnings disguised as concern. The system didn't like people who shook it too hard. And Aaliyah? She had just shattered it. Marcus was the one who voiced the concern outright. "They're going to find a way to make you the problem," he told her over coffee one morning, his eyes scanning the restaurant like someone might be listening. "They always do. You got Reeves, but now they're looking at you. Waiting for you to slip up." Aaliyah stirred her coffee, unmoved. "Let them look," she said simply. "I don't have anything to hide." Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. "That's not the point. The truth doesn't matter to them, Aaliyah. The narrative does. You know how they work. You think they won't dig into every case you've ever touched? Every decision you've made? Every moment of your life that they can twist into a weakness? Aaliyah met his gaze, her expression unshaken. Then I'll make sure the truth is louder. And she did. She didn't fade into the background, didn't let the system quietly push her aside. She leaned in. She took interviews, spoke at panels, brought light to the cases still buried in paperwork. She made sure that Reeves wasn't just a moment but a turning point. And the public? They listened. Community leaders reached out. Activists took to the streets. Families of those wrongfully convicted under Reeves' watch demanded retrials. Lawsuits were filed. The city was forced to take action, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because now, people were watching. And Aaliyah? She thrived. She wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. She was a voice. A force that couldn't be silenced. And while the system tried to find a way to erase her, to reduce her to just another name in a headline that would eventually fade, she refused to let that happen. She kept pushing. Kept fighting. And in doing so, she became something more than they had ever expected. A reckoning. 1 year after Reeves' arrest, Aaliyah Carter stood in front of a room full of young law students, her presence commanding, her voice unwavering as she spoke. The law is only as strong as the people willing to fight for it, she told them. You don't change a broken system by waiting for permission. You don't wait for justice to happen, you make it happen. And if that makes people uncomfortable, good. Because discomfort is where change begins. The room erupted in applause. And in that moment, she knew, this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. This story isn't just about one corrupt officer. It's about power. About who holds it, who abuses it, and who fights back. It's about the people who think they are untouchable, until one day, they're not. But most of all, it's about the choices we make. So now, I want to ask you something. What would you have done in Aaliyah's place? Would you have fought back, knowing the risks? Would you have stood your ground, knowing the system was against you? Or would you have walked away? Let's talk about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, I want to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed this story, if you want more powerful narratives with real stakes, real twists, and real justice, then make sure to hit that subscribe button. This is Tales of Twist. And trust me, there's more to come.